Welcome to the Defense Support Podcast. I'm Stewart Webb, editor and senior analyst, and joining me today, of course, is Chris Murray, associate editor and senior analyst, and we're going to be talking about the Iranian war, but in a broader context with the United States, the Allies, intelligence sharing, and so forth.
I think there's a lot to unpack, so I think it's worth, taking a step back. Last time we were talking about the irregular and asymmetrical elements of the war. One of the reasons we were locking in on that is I spent a lot of time sort of cautioning against jumping to conclusions too early, and the reason for this is probably obvious to most people, is it risks locking you into a view that could prove incorrect and lead us like astray on how we process and interpret what we're seeing. But that cuts both ways, right? I've been directing those comments towards folks that I felt were a bit quick to jump all over Trump and claim disaster because of how they feel about him. But it's important that you and I also stress that this applies to administration that could, find itself pretty quickly locked into an escalation spiral that, for the same reasons of limited view. And like, so far I've made a conscious effort to avoid the pile on and highlight that this isn't black and white, but there are some important and valid points to what the U.S. is doing, even if this might just be a case of the blind hog finding the occasional acorn. But to give critics their due, and because in this last week, we've seen a lot come out of the White House that speaks to the phenomenon of like limiting views, steering results. You and I had discussed like whether they were getting these in-depth assessments or just ignoring them, and I suspect that they were just ignoring them. Um, but because of all that and what I see happening in terms of the direction they're headed, there's a few key points I think we should highlight. I think to start with, the easiest one is air power doesn't win wars, not on its own. It makes room to win wars, but a bombing campaign won't work unless it's incredibly well executed. The civilian population is with you against the regime. There's a whole bunch of other conditions that need to be met. And one of the other things too is that I want to come back to is like, I don't want to talk about it right now because I want to come back to it, but you have to be executing it very well. Targeting civilian infrastructure is not a good idea if you're trying to get the people to revolt, right? The air power doesn't work, not on
Yeah,
its own.
totally. And we should highlight President Trump's Truth Social tweet that he did earlier today. Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the effing straight, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise to be Allah, President Donald J. Trump.
Yeah,
That's not really a social post that would indicate that you actually have the situation underhand, right?
well, I think it's a case of Trump casting about because he sees what's coming down the pipeline in terms of the global economy, and he's starting to grab at reckless options. Targeting infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, and thinking that's going to speed up the process of the rising up, and it's dangerously counterproductive, and it's likely to achieve the opposite of what he's after. I mean, we could talk about that's a point I want to talk about is why this is happening. But again, you and I were talking about this before we came on, and I just want to stress like air power doesn't work, and the Americans should know this, right? I pointed out to Vietnam, and you had pointed out Libya, right?
Vietnam, there were ground forces on the trying
Hmm.
to fight the Viet Cong. In Libya, there was a loose rebel coalition that was trying to take back from Gaddafi. However, when NATO intervened, Gaddafi had pretty much taken over Libya, and of course, the rebel forces did overthrow the regime. But in Iran, as you and I were talking about, there's no ground force, there's no rebels. The protests are have no leadership essentially and
Yeah,
no
so this brings
coordination.
us to, yeah, that brings me to the next point I wanted to talk about is um, the civilian population being against the regime. I've stated that I'm pretty hopeful that like I have a lot of faith in in the Iranian people, especially the youth. But saying the civilian population is against the regime is a simplistic statement, right? Like I don't know if you caught the New York Times bit with David French discussing this with General Stanley McChrystal over the weekend, but there are two Iranians, right? There's the youth and the older generation that fought the Iran-Iraq War and who lived through the revolution and the overthrow of an unpopular American-backed regime, the Shah, right? And they have radically different lived experiences and perspectives towards the regime and the war. And McChrystal points out, as you just alluded to, he said the same thing. There's no solid unified opposition movement or leader. The regime's been very good at preventing one, right? They've been vicious and brutal, and it does raise doubts about the possibility of converting public dissatisfaction into the overthrow of the regime, especially when, as you pointed out in Vietnam, they had boots on the ground I mean, to be fair, the regime wasn't popular, but that they were defending the South Vietnamese regime. But without boots on the ground, it's there's only so far you can reach, right?
Totally. And I would also argue that there's probably a third split as well. I mean, there are youth that have joined the IRGC and the army that, I mean, especially if you're part of the IRGC, you do have benefits, economic,
Big
financial,
time. Yeah.
right, health services, wherever else. And looking at, if you're a member of the IRGC and taking a look at the average Iranian, you're going to still be beholden to the regime because you don't want to deal with that suffering that they're dealing with as well, right? So they've kind of created that as well.
So one of the things that the other point that I wanted to talk about, which I suppose that sort of leads into a little bit, is the ability of the current U.S. administration to exploit what does come up in Iran effectively. Last week I read Sir Lawrence Friedman discussing how the U.S. State Department's been hollowed out and the building is apparently like pretty empty and you can like literally hear your own steps echoing down the halls. Like what that means in practical terms is that although Rubio might be involved in the decision-making process, he doesn't have depth of professional staff assessments that it should be informing his decision, informing those decisions. And that goes beyond the State Department. All structures that are, critical to crisis management in the US have been shrunk or disbanded. Uh, John Cipher, I think his name is, at the Bulwark. He just wrote a piece on how the hollowing out of the intelligence community that's excellent, and people should go and read that. They've suffered significant losses of personnel and knowledge and capacity uh, through resignations and purges, which is a word I would use. I'm using deliberately. Much of America's like most valuable intelligence also it's not from satellites and unilateral espionage alone. It's from relationships with allies and partners that have been significantly degraded.
I'd also like to highlight that Hegseth has fired 8 generals. The FBI and the CIA have had, like you said, purges. The head, Tulsi Gabbard, has been a bit of a conspiracy theorist as well.
Well, yeah, I think she's a useful idiot, to put it mildly. Uh,
That and that's a Soviet term from the Cold War
yeah, I
that
think I hope most of our listeners understand what I just referenced when I said that.
yeah.
And if not, yeah, I think a Kremlin stooge without realizing she's a Kremlin stooge. Um,
But yeah, to
I
get
don't make any apologies for saying that. I think she's dangerous. So
But to even get back to intelligence sharing, the British have stopped intelligence sharing with the United States on several levels. I think Canada as well. Even logistically, right now, I believe France has closed its airspace to military logistics for Israel. Spain's closed off its airspace for U.S. aircraft, and also the base in Sicily as well. It's both been closed off for American aircraft too. So it's not even just intelligence. Our allies are closing off.
right, and all of this matters because we mentioned Vietnam a minute ago, and we were talking about the Iranian public, and there's more than one group there, and it made me think of something, and it took me a second to remember it because I got caught up in what you were saying and I lost it. And I want to mention it now. Is one of the things the U.S. does is they're very happy to forget things that are difficult or inconvenient. So, like in Vietnam, for example, cultural intelligence, right? Like the human terrain system, for example, is one. I don't know if that was a Vietnam era, but there's different iterations along the way. I wrote that article for in the NATO Defense Against Terrorism review journal where I was talking about the need for a permanent, large-scale staff of cultural awareness, so that when you go into these things, you understand what you're talking about, and that capacity is not there. And this sort of brings me to why intelligence is so important, right? And why the hollowing of it out is so important. And it's a system for like putting reality into the policy process and informing decisions. It's not just about collecting information. It's about in-depth analysis, right? Competing interpretations, red team skepticism, and you know the professional speaking truth to power. Military strategy, foreign policy, they depend on that process. We succeed when intelligence, diplomacy, military planning, counterintelligence, and managing our alliances are forced into a conversation with one another, and that conversation is falling apart. There are, for example, when I'm talking about human terrain, there are allies of the U.S., like the British, for example, who do that better than they do. And one of the greatest dangers in intelligence is like the isolating, the siloing, and politicization of the intelligence system. And that appears to be the direction I fear the U.S. is headed. And history teaches us that those conditions always lead to disaster. And like we're already seeing it, right? The Economist was reporting like morale at the CIA is in the toilet. retirements and attrition are accelerating. And like as that happens, frustration is just going to get deeper and deeper among intelligence professionals, especially if they feel like their work is being distorted or disregarded. And if it creates a culture in which intelligence professionals decide that the honest analysis is pointless or detrimental to their career, and it depends on telling power not truth to power, but telling power what they want to hear, that's a much larger problem than the Straits of Hormuz being closed, right?
Totally. And there's also a trend that started with the George W. Bush administration that there was an increase in the privatization of
Hmm.
intelligence, right? So all of a sudden, other companies were now, competing to offer intelligence to the United States, which also opens up a huge issue for me as well, because all of a sudden, what intelligence goes to the best buyer in the United States, right? Having competing views, you don't really have that culture, that organizational culture where you can actually, like you said, have the red team, blue team,
Hmm.
has some skepticism. All of a sudden, you're just buying a product.
Well, politicians in particular really don't like red teaming, which is why it's so important
Yeah,
because it pokes holes in their beautiful plans. But you know what you just alluded to, that's not just intelligence. Privatization is something that's happening across the U.S. foreign policy and defense sector, and not just that. I was talking about this with my wife earlier. There's also fewer companies than there used to be, right? There's a lot more merging, and there's fewer companies for lack of or agents or different perspectives. You're narrowing it down,
to
and they've been at. I mean, yes, the U.S. has been at war, but it's been peacetime, if that makes sense. They haven't been under siege in a state-to-state conflict, so they've had a lot of luxury of space and time, and the military-industrial complex has made hay while the sun has shined, right?
yeah, and to have a different voice. There's a great company I know. It's called Defense Support. It offers security and defense analysis to anyone that wants to hire us as a contract basis. So if you're listening to this at the Department of War or the State
Yeah,
Department,
you might want
uh,
to
yeah,
talk to
give
us.
yeah. Uh, our contacts are on the about page of our website, which is defensesupport.com.
And we're not American, which offers an external perspective, which I think is like genuinely really important. And the Americans in particular seem quite resistant to it. And I understand why. I'm not I'm not saying that they're just ignorant or anything like that. I get it. Given if you understand the history of like post Second World War or Cold War era and relationships with allies that were, for the most part, in Europe and barely hanging on by a thread for decades, right? You can understand why Suez Crisis, for example, too, is not those sorts of events didn't really lend themselves to the Americans looking upon their allies favorably.
True, but I mean, let's go back to Afghanistan and also Libya.
Well,
Uh,
Afghanistan and the French warned them. They were right.
yeah, but I wrote another journal article for the NATO Defense Against Terrorism Review Journal. Really should be getting money for advertising these guys. About the lack of tactical and operational intelligence sharing within the NATO alliance. You actually
Mhm.
had the French realize that they can send up a plane, do the imagery analysis, bring down, print out the photos, take a look, and then send up a strike package. And it was a lot quicker to do that than to ask permission from the Americans for the satellite imagery.
Yeah, and that's well, and the U.S. learned this after 9/11 with internally, right?
Yeah,
With between their intelligence agencies, and that should have been transferred out. But this actually is really good point to segue to my next thing that I wanted to say, which is I've discussed the internal damage, but externally among allies, right? This growing distrust, and you pointed out to me the other day, the UK hosted a talks with 35 countries about reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and the US were significantly not a part of it. So there's the other sort of end of, or the other side of the coin with regards to this degrading intelligence thing and unilateral action is this growing distrust, which is not good for anyone. Like in previous discussions, I've argued that the finger wagging amongst the Europeans towards the Yanks, it was pointless. It was even stupid. Like it or not, the straits were and are going to have to be forcibly reopened. We can't cede that decision to the Iranians. That's dangerous. If we do that, we'll be back here again and again and again on the whims of the Ayatollah. But the point I want to make here is that the distrust among the allies is already there. The damage is already being done. And the problem here is that the Europeans want to write off the Americans and go their own way, which I understand because the president of the United States is saying the same thing. But the reality is neither of them can do this without the other. The fact is, all parties need to grow up and face up to that. And the intelligence sharing alone should make that clear. But I think at some point it's going to have to be someone on the European side that needs to be the grown up in the room and realize that performative posturing against Trump, however repugnant he may be in your view, it needs to stop. Like it or not, they need to get on board and work with the Americans. I want to really highlight that I said Trump and now I'm saying the Americans, right? There's a
Yeah.
difference between the two, but you need to work with the Americans and reopen the streets. And while doing so, have a very frank, private, importantly, private conversation behind closed doors with Trump and his administration. Doing it publicly ignores what we already know about Trump and his administration. It's pointlessly damaging. It's self-harm. I was saying to you, Stewart, that I felt it was a massive miscalculation on the part of NATO allies to respond to American requests for assistance in the way they have. We've listened since 2016 as these leaders lament Trump's disregard for the importance of NATO. And now, when you have a chance to demonstrate that importance and simultaneously paint President Trump into a corner on the issue, you choose to reinforce his beliefs instead. We have to move past talking to Trump and dealing with Trump. Or when I say we, I mean them. I shouldn't say we. I mean those leaders and think not in terms of Trump, but of America and of Americans and the American establishment of what's left of it, anyways, while it's still there, right? So I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I'm not trying to defend the Americans here or defend Trump's behavior, but I think that there's a lot more depth to this than is really it's being treated with.
No, and the UAE has stepped up, regionally to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz militarily with the United States. And I just want to have a quick note. If if the United States and Europe can't talk about operational intelligence sharing within a NATO alliance, how degraded is that going to be for the UAE and the United States? Europe has been relying on the Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb as the Trump whisperer. And you are right that you need to start talking to the administration. My question is, how do you talk to the administration when you've got Rubio, you've got Tulsi Gabbard, you've got Hegseth? Because you're talking to stooges essentially, right? So you're going to have to go several layers down to administration, right? To the civil servants. But it's hard to do that, as you and I were discussing, that they've already essentially been fleshed out, right?
Well, as the Italians say, between saying and doing lies the sea, right? So it's easy for me to sit here and say, "Oh, yeah, you need to talk to the Americans," but yeah, the points you're raising are, critical to that statement I've made, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard to see how we go forward. It'd be great just to say, well, everything will get better after Trump, but we've got 2 more years essentially.
Two or
And
three,
two
two.
or th
Yeah, I guess two. I mean, I understand what you're saying when you say two. Yeah, it makes sense because
Yeah,
the last year they're going to be because they're basically constantly in campaign mode down there. It's pretty insane.
exactly. So, we've got, 2, 3 years. How degraded is our relationship, and not just Canada's, but Europe, NATO's, the West's relationship with the United States going to be? And we can even probably even throw it in Japan.
Yeah, you see, yeah,
Yeah, you were talking to this before, is that Japan's starting to move towards Russian oil again.
yeah. They're signaling a pivot on their Russian policy, which is understandable. Um, if you're going to disregard all these alliance networks and relationships that have become dependent on you, then you can't be surprised when, like, if you want to go it alone, you can't be surprised when you are alone. You need to understand what that means. And one of the things I want to bring up is when you're talking about like how are we going to reach them, I think economics is going to really hit home with them really soon. I've got some numbers in front of me, and I haven't had a chance to verify them. I just have some notes. But apparently in 2024, the US foreign military sales notifications to Europe was like 76 billion, 4 times what it was since 2008 in terms of average. I don't know if that sounds right to you or not, but um, I think regardless of the number, the point is most of the Europeans spend a lot of money on military equipment in the US, right? Um, but Europe's now got this massive, like billion, hundreds of billion-dollar defense plan, and American contractors are essentially being frozen out, right? I think their goal is something like 80% of all military purchases to come from European factories by 2030, which is like breakneck speed. That's 4 years, if I'm reading this correctly. Um,
Yeah, that's the security action for
well,
Europe.
the thing that
And
people got to, sorry, the thing I want to say is like all of that comes with like the buying the stuff from the Americans. All of that comes with decades of service contracts, maintenance agreements, spare parts, software updates, training programs, hundreds of billions of dollars or more. So all of these massive defense programs that the U.S. is able to pursue, that has the luxury of pursuing, is largely because it's subsidized by the Europeans through the military contracts, the money they spend, which is not something that the current U.S. administration would like to hear. You know, when they talk about not paying their way, and they have a valid point. As you know, Stuart, I've been incredibly vocal about Canada and the rest of NATO not pulling their weight and it being completely unfair to the U.S. that they just, oh well, you know, we have the U.S. behind us, so we don't have to. That's bullshit. So I do think that it's unfortunate, but I don't think the Americans have been trying to talk to their allies about this, especially Canada, about spending more, and it wasn't happening. And I don't think it would ha I don't, from the Americans' perspective, I don't see any other way other than a public swift kick in the ass, which is what happened. Um, but because of the way it was handled, and again, I don't know that the Americans had another option on this, but because of the way it's happened, there's a bunch of disengagement, and that's going to really hit their defense sector hard. And I think that's going to be one of those things that sort of reaches through the static and the noise
yeah,
to the administration is, I mean, dollars, especially in the US, and this isn't a criticism, but the Americans know money makes the world go round, right? It's one of the things I kind of appreciate and why I want to work down there is they get it. But that's going to have an impact on the administration in the same way that the straits being closed and impacting the global economy is. And Trump can be like, well, it's not our problem and you need to open it. But there's a reason you're seeing his messaging shift the way it is, in my opinion.
yeah. To get back to defense exports from the United States to Europe, I mean, in Canada right now, we're talking about maybe purchasing the Gripen from Sweden Saab. The United States has red card on that, and that's with the ITAR, the U.S. Arms Trade Export Controls.
Yeah, I forget what it exactly stands for, but it regulates import and export of weapons and military equipment, right?
The U.S. International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and so even U.S. systems are in European, aircraft, tanks, etc. So the United States could really just like, oh, okay, well, we're going to actually impose ITAR on a bunch of stuff, and Europe will have to like either put their own systems in or actually have a meaningful conversation with the United States as well, right? Because there is
Well, and
that.
that's I think the European fear and why they're moving away is they're like, you know, Trump was talking about retarding the abilities of the F-35 for some allies and stuff like that. And like, I mean, I don't think it's realistically something that they actually do need to be worried about in the long term. But again, like, yeah, that's driving people away. There's concern, legitimate concern there, right?
Yeah, and to quickly go back to SAFE, UK's actually been frozen out of the security action for Europe because they didn't want
I
to
didn't know
spend.
that.
Yeah, well, it's because they didn't want to spend the multi-billion-dollar fee.
That's a
Canada,
shame.
Canada paid, I think it was like $500 million. I could be wrong. This is on the top of my head to actually get into the program, so Canadian businesses can compete within SAFE.
Wow, when you're desperate to look like you're spending 2% of GDP, a big $100 million bill really helps bump up those numbers, right?
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about that one soon. So
Yeah. But I mean, th those were the things that I hadn't said thus far, and I wanted to say because again, I really wanted to. I didn't want to be part of that pile on. I wanted to restrain myself, and I wanted to caution people like, hey, this is way more complicated. There's more than one side to this. Just because you don't like the Trump or you don't like what the Americans are doing, it doesn't mean it's wrong. Uh, Iran is still a bad actor. They're bad guys. The Iranian regime is bad. Um, Not dealing with it isn't an option. Just like not spending 2% on GDP on defense was not an option. It can only last for so long. So there's a plenty of blame to go around here. You know, this is one of the things I keep saying is if you don't like the way things are, it's you guys have been setting policy for decades and doing it this way, and it's not going anywhere. But there needs to be a recognition on both sides that the current trajectory and how to deal with this, the methodology, you know, it's incredibly self-harming, and there's a lot of long-term consequences that I think that their policies are they're starting to feel already, especially with regards to like the State Department and the intelligence community and their allies.
I hate to say this, but I doubt the Strait of Hormuz is going to be the lesson that breaks Europe and the United States to actually start talking in a meaningful way.
And that's a shame because I'd love to see this retreat reversed. Splendid isolationism isn't going to work for the Americans. It's never worked. And more importantly, I think the world needs more America, not less. And I don't care if that's an unpopular opinion right now. I think we need to get back to working together.
Well, I
And
think,
I'm afraid you're right.
and I'm afraid that we do need more America, but we need more responsible America.
Yeah, the America of old, right?
Well, and on that note, we should probably wrap it up. Chris, thank you again for coming on this podcast and having a chat.
A pleasure as always, buddy.
And again, if anyone from the U.S. State Department or Department of War want to
Give us a
hire
ring.
staff, please do. Right? We like money,
Yeah, reach us out. Reach out. We're in Canada, so we're really poor.
right?
Houses are expensive. Food's
Right.
expensive. Help us.
Gas is expensive.
Yeah,
We're
especially.
not going to talk about why.
Okay. All right.
All right. Take
Take care.
care.
Yeah, take care.
And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for listening to the Defense Support Podcast. Podcast can be found on Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Don't forget to follow the channel. Leave us a comment. It helps with us being found by others. There is more content on the website, of course. Have a great day, and until next time.